Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. We are so glad to have you with us today for the launch of Doubling Down on Nature, the State of Investment in Nature-Based Solutions for Water Security 2025, hosted by the Forest Trends and the Nature Conservancy. My name is Jenna Gammy. I'm the Director of the Global Water Initiative at Forest Trends, and I will be moderating the webinar today. Water is at the heart of everything, our health, our food, and our economies. It powers our homes, our data centers, and our energy grids. And for much of the world, water is also the most visible face of climate change. Last year, we saw record-breaking droughts and floods, both devastating lives and straining already overburdened water systems. The urgency to build resilience into our water infrastructure has never been greater. That's where nature comes in. Nature-based solutions like restoring wetlands, protecting forests, and improving agricultural practices offer powerful, proven tools to manage water risks, often at lower cost and with greater co-benefits than conventional approaches. When paired with built infrastructure like dams and treatment plants, they can strengthen communities and ecosystems against a changing climate. Forest Trends first started tracking finance flowing to nature for water in 2010. Our last global assessment of watershed investments was published in 2016. We're so pleased to have partnered with the Nature Conservancy to produce this report, which represents the most comprehensive global assessment to date of investments in nature for water security. It answers key questions like who's investing, where's the money going, and what's driving growth. The big takeaway, which you can see in the title of today's event and the report, is that investment in nature-based solutions for water has doubled over the past decade. That's progress, but we also know it's not enough. Public finance continues to lead, but private capital is starting to emerge, bringing new opportunities and also new questions. So we'll dig into all of that today. Today, we'll hear from two of the authors of the report, as well as leaders and practitioners from around the world about how we turn this momentum into mainstream action. We hope this report helps spark that next wave of investment because the future of water security depends on it. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping notes. First, interpretation is available today in Spanish, Portuguese, and French. Please select your preference by clicking on the interpretation globe icon at the bottom of the screen. English speakers should select the English channel. We'll be using the Q&A feature throughout the session. You can submit your questions at any time, and you can upvote questions you would like to hear answered. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can during the discussion. And finally, a huge thank you to our sponsoring partners who made this report and today's event possible: the D.N. Batten Foundation, the Alumbra Innovations Foundation, Coca-Cola, and Microsoft. Your support is helping to shine a light on these real solutions, and we really appreciate your support. So finally, thanks to all of you for making the time to be here with us this morning. We're so excited to share the report with you, so let's go ahead and get started. So now I'm excited to introduce someone who's been at the heart of this work from the very beginning. Mia Smith is the lead author of Doubling Down on Nature, the State of Investment in Nature-Based Solutions for Water Security. Mia is the program manager of the Global Water Initiative at Forest Trends. An engineer by training, she's led this global assessment with deep analytical rigor and an eye for the real-world implications of the numbers. She's spent the past year working with our global team of researchers and partners to track where finance is flowing, who's investing, and what's driving the changes. She'll walk us through the key findings of the report. Over to you, Mia.
Thank you, Jenna, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending where you're at in the world. Super excited to share the findings from this report with you all finally. As Jenna mentioned, it's called the State of Investment in Nature-Based Solutions for Water Security. We've tracked thousands of projects and programs in this report, and we definitely didn't do it alone. I'm the lead author of the report. I'll be giving you an overview today, but we had an amazing group of advisory board members who supported us from the start, from scoping and data collection all the way to making sense of some of the findings that we found, as well as an amazing group of research assistants located and focused on different geographies that really helped us get depth in different parts of the world. So just a brief overview before we really dive in. I'll be going through the scope, what was it that we studied and included in the report before giving an overview of the main trends and then looking at the data in 3 different ways. Specifically looking at payers, who's investing, mechanisms, how they're investing, and then finally my favorite part of the report, which is the trends by geography, where they're investing and what are some of the different programs and trends that we see across the world. At the end, I'll be handing it over to Brooke Atwell from the Nature Conservancy to walk us through key recommendations that accompany the data in the report. So what's in this report? What's the scope covered? This is the most comprehensive assessment in nature-based solutions for water to date. We tracked over 1,600 initiatives across 140 countries. We'll continue to say nature-based solutions for water a lot in the report and in this presentation, but what exactly does that include? We looked at initiatives that met 3 criteria. The first is that the project or program directly supported nature-based interventions on the ground. The on-the-ground piece really focuses on the implementation activity or the quote-unquote construction activity, whether it be tree planting, wetland restoration, etc. Our focus wasn't to include all of the important research, design, pre-design efforts that lead you up to that implementation point. The second was that the intervention took place in a terrestrial, freshwater, or brackish ecosystem. These interventions could have impacts on freshwater or even marine water environments, but what we excluded here were interventions that took place in marine environments like coral reefs. And then the third is that the intervention had an explicit water security objective. We weren't evaluating whether these projects would meet a water security objective or not. We weren't looking at a reforestation project and trying to wonder if it had impacts on the watershed. We really relied on the projects and programs to tell us that. And there it's also important to note that we didn't do any evaluation of effectiveness of these projects in this program. That was, I mean, in this report, that's out of scope. We're really just tracking the amount of investment that's flowing to these types of interventions. So why did we do this report? Globally, we see a growing water crisis. There's increasing water scarcity as well as flooding, and all of this can have real impacts on our society through global food production, impacts on built infrastructure, loss of life, decrease in biodiversity. And we really believe that nature-based solutions can deliver a solution to face this water crisis. Nature-based solutions from forest restoration, wetland conservation, a whole host of different solutions that we'll be looking in the later part of this report, can deliver benefits like recharging our groundwater aquifers, storing more water in the system to be available when there are dry seasons or dry spells, regulating our climate, reducing flooding and landslides, and improving water quality. So this is our why, and what we really wanted to understand, I think if you're here on the webinar, it's because you already work in this space or you have interest in learning about this space. There's a growing conversation about nature-based solutions and water security, but we wanted to know, is that really translating to investments on the ground? And so that's why we went through the effort of tracking all of these different projects, collecting data on their investments. And what we found is, as Jenna mentioned at the start of the call, our headline figure is that global investments for water security doubled over the last decade, reaching almost $50 billion in 2023. So there's definite growth in this sector. We saw growth in every geography that we studied. And it's worth mentioning here before we dive into the different trends, it would have been impossible to capture every single program or project. So we expect these numbers to be conservative, but we do believe that our data collection was robust enough to be able to understand the main trends that are going on. So when we look at different payer types or different geographies, where is growing the fastest, we believe that those conclusions are robust, even though the actual numbers may be conservative. China, the US, and the European Union are three economies that accounted for most of the investment in 2023. This graph shows us the different investment by regions. The gray bubbles are the size of the investment. And so you'll notice three big bubbles at the top. But what's really interesting here is that the other regions and other parts of the world experienced a much more growth, remarkable growth, even compared to the global trends. We saw great growth in Africa, where there was 5 times growth over the last decade, as well as Oceania, Latin America, and Asia. Particularly in Peru, there was 7 times growth over last decade. And in Africa and South Africa and New Zealand, we saw interesting programs that recognize not only the environmental benefit of these types of projects, but the benefits to employment and local communities. So there is South Africa's Working for Water program and New Zealand's Jobs for Nature program that use nature-based solutions as an opportunity to provide employment for local communities. What's in these, oops, I skipped one. What's in these, the design of these programs? What we saw is nature-based solutions initiatives prioritize investing in forestry and ranching best management practices. This might look like sustainable management of forests or rotational grazing of cattle herds, both which can reduce erosion and improve downstream water quality, as well as a host of other water benefits. These took place most commonly in forests that are so important for our watersheds, as well as surface water ecosystems like lakes and rivers. We also tracked the water security objectives that were motivating these interventions. And what we found is that mitigating flood risk was the most powerful water-focused motivation. We've seen increasing devastating floods around the world in recent years. We've seen them in Pakistan and Brazil, in the southeastern United States. And what we've seen in the data is that governments are using nature-based solutions to respond to that flood risk. That was followed by initiatives that reduce the risk of low water quality, as well as water shortage and droughts. All of this data is also in our report, broken out by geography, which I think is really interesting. We won't have time to go into that into this report. Again, this is an orientation to what types of information you might find in the report, but I really encourage you to download the report, look at the figures, the tables, especially if you have a specific geographic region in mind, you'll be able to see this specifically for the part of the world you're interested in. So next, we'll be taking a look at payers. Who is investing? And here we found basically the trend line tracks with what Forest Trends has been tracking for over 15 years, that most of this investment is coming from governments investing domestically. This makes sense as providing water for residents and protecting cities is really inherently providing for the public good and really closely related to government functions. So most of the investment that we tracked is coming from governments at all levels, whether that be at the European Union level, encompassing multiple countries, the country level, or down to state, provincial, municipal, or city levels. And investment at all levels has doubled over the last decade, in line with our overall trend. What's interesting is that while governments are continuing to provide the majority of investments, other types of actors outside of government have really increased participation over the last 10 years, reflecting an overall growing confidence in nature-based solutions and a willingness to invest in these solutions. Water utilities grew 3 times over the last decade. In Peru specifically, for example, there has been a change in the way that they set tariffs that have allowed them to charge a percentage to users to cover watershed conservation or to invest in water conservation. And almost all, if not all, of the water utilities in Peru are now participating in that way. We also saw an increase from multilateral institutions, including the World Bank, Green Climate Fund, Global Environment Facility, that are really promoting nature-based solutions as part of their design packages. And encouraging in many cases that they be included within broader traditional gray infrastructure packages as a hybrid approach that includes both engineered solutions as well as nature-based solutions, or traditional engineered solutions and nature-based solutions. Finally, private sector investment. This was the fastest growing payer type. We saw 30 times growth over the last decade, which is really incredible. Most of this was required by regulation. About 70% of the private sector involvement we captured here was required by regulation, including interesting water quality trading programs, which we'll cover a little bit later when we take a look at the mechanisms, and a notable program in California, which uses the state greenhouse gas cap and trade system to invest in environmental projects. So private companies are charged on their greenhouse gas emissions, not necessarily related to the water, but the state then administers those funds to a whole host of different environmental projects. We tracked what was specifically going to nature-based solutions for water. And in the case of California, we found that specifically a lot of that was going towards managing wildfire risk. In California, we've seen devastating wildfires. And so the government, state government there is really investing in CAL FIRE, the State Department of Fire Management, to be able to sustainably manage forest and use nature-based solutions to improve forest and watershed health. Next way we'll take a look at this data is through mechanisms. In this report, we tracked 5 different mechanisms. You'll find a section on each in the report. Again, just a quick overview here. One of the largest was landholder incentive programs. These are government programs that provide direct payments to farmers or other landholders to change how they're interacting with the landscape for environmental outcomes, in this case, specifically water outcomes. They're typically very large programs that have been in place for decades, operating at national levels or at the EU level. And they're very large programs. What we found is there was about 20 of these programs with an average size of over $1 billion per initiative. So really large programs that accounted for about half of investment in 2023. That's contrasted with what we've called other public good investments. These are other public investments that are acting in the greater public good. This category is also about 48%, the same size as the other. And what's included in here are investments in nature as infrastructure. So we're seeing more governments realize that nature-based solutions really are part of an infrastructure package. For example, in the Netherlands, which is a low-lying country really prone to flood risk, they have centuries of experience in building complicated systems of dams, flood control structures, levees, et cetera. And what recently they've been doing, increasingly doing, is investing in floodplain restoration and other nature-based solutions to really complement those other traditional infrastructure investments. We've also seen this in the US. There was recent pledged commitments through the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, that really began to incorporate investments in nature as infrastructure. And while the implementation of those may now be in question, it really shows that these types of investments are getting included at very high levels into public policy. The next mechanism we tracked are user-driven investments through direct beneficiaries of watershed services. So these are really much more of a local scale, local utilities, cities, and companies worried about their specific watershed. A great example is in the city of San Antonio in the US, which depends on groundwater for their residents. The groundwater aquifer naturally recharged in previous years, but as the city expands and hardscapes more of the area, they're seeing impacts of that development and urban development on the recharge of the groundwater aquifer. So they've included a municipal program and part of their municipal budget to address those through nature-based solutions, like increasing parkways along creek sides and protecting groundwater recharge zones. These are much smaller compared to the other programs, and again, much more locally tailored. The last slide here on mechanisms includes two different market-based mechanisms. The first are environmental water markets that we tracked. A great example to give you a flavor of what these look like is in Australia in the Murray-Darling Basin, which is the country's largest watershed. The government wanted to restore water in that watershed and started a program where they purchased water rights from farmers who voluntarily, in some cases, sold water rights that they would have otherwise used to irrigate crops to the government, who then set those aside to just ensure water levels in the environment. Another type that we saw are water quality trading programs. These exist in certain places to trade water quality credits. For example, in the eastern US, there are regulatory limits that regulate how much nutrients or other water quality contaminants are in the effluent, for example, of a wastewater treatment plant. And the wastewater treatment plant can do a cost-benefit analysis and consider, does it make sense to upgrade our wastewater treatment plant, or we could alternatively buy water quality credits from somebody that's reducing water quality off-site. And these programs, in some cases, are including nature-based solutions, for example, actions from farmers, sustainable agriculture practices, et cetera. We also saw nitrogen trading credit programs in New Zealand, as well as a new program in Australia called the Reef Credit Program that's focused on protecting water quality going into the Great Barrier Reef. One of the main takeaways in the analysis that we did by mechanisms is that we're seeing a growth in the diversity. Historically, public incentives for landholders was the main way that we invested in ecosystems for water. Again, these public incentives for landholders in many cases have been in place going back to the 90s, or in some cases in the US, even the 70s. And so they've really been a historical investment mechanism. But what we're seeing over the last decade is all other mechanisms, which were less at the start of the decade in 2013 in the gray line, are really creeping up and growing in a much larger way. By 2021, they caught up to these public incentives for landholders, and now there's many more investment mechanisms that are part of the picture, which just means in many cases that we're seeing more diversity of smaller projects that look different, adapted locally as part of our solution package. Finally, my favorite part of the report, this is the trends by geography. It's towards the end of the report, so don't miss it. It's a couple pages on each geographical region and is really rich with specific examples. When we look at global investment in 2023 by country, we really see here that China stands out in their investment. China leads global investment in nature-based solutions for water. This has been the case since previous global forest trends reports. In 2023, China invested more than the rest of the world combined. And this really comes from decades of public policy evolution following historic droughts and flooding that the country experienced in the 90s. In one year in the 1990s, the Yellow River, which historically has flown all the way out to the ocean, 200 days out of the year was running dry before it hit the ocean. So there was really a crisis moment where residents and governments started to realize we need to do something about the environmental degradation in our country. So now over 99.9% of investment in China is through government programs. In Europe, we're similarly seeing large government programs, primarily by the European Union, specifically large landholder incentives here as well through the Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, which really provides support for farmers and rural economies and encourages and incentivizes sustainable practices, as well as a whole host of other EU instruments. We also saw growth in Europe in national programs for flood control in several countries, as well as user-driven investments through water agencies and utilities. In the US and Canada, most of the investment was driven through landholder incentives. primarily through a mechanism that actually dates back to the Dust Bowl in the 1930s in the US, where environmental degradation led to a crisis of drought, dust storms, that was really causing havoc and issues for farmers and society. The government started to incentivize farmers to plant cover crops and change other practices that would help respond to this crisis. Decades later, this consolidated into the investments through a federal agency now known as the National Resource Conservation Service that accounted for about half of the investment that we saw in US and Canada in 2023. In Oceania, there's two important points here. We saw a lot of innovation through market-based mechanisms, some of which we called out earlier in the call in Australia and New Zealand, as well as Indigenous leadership that's really exemplified in this case that we've noted here on the slide, the Waikato Rivers Authority. The Maori people were able to negotiate co-governance structures with equal representation with the Crown government to be able to manage their natural resources, and in this case, specifically advocate and invest in restoring local rivers. Here we start to see foreign assistance and multilateral institutions playing more of a role than we saw in the other regions. This investment in Oceania is flowing particularly to small island-based nations outside of Australia and New Zealand. The next three slides, which are Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean and Africa, you'll see that government spending is still a big part of the picture, but some of the other colors start to come through. Some of the other players start to play a bigger role. In Asia, outside of China, we saw examples by water user fees in South Korea and Vietnam. In Vietnam, there's a very large program which charges water user fees on private water users. In this case, it's primarily on hydropower production facilities that produce electricity in the country, and those are collected and invested into forest restoration. Similarly, in South Korea, there's charges on water use that then go to manage for large river basins in the country. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we see large domestic government investments. There are landholder incentive programs in 5 countries in this region. And I mentioned earlier that there was incredible growth in Peru over the last decade. This really followed some changes in their public policy system, which allowed the country to use the public investment system previously used to invest in roads, hospitals, schools, traditional gray infrastructure, to now use that system to invest in restoring degraded watersheds. Forest Trends led a project there called the Natural Infrastructure for Water Security Project, where we worked with government officials, public policy officials, engineers, designers, local communities, a whole host of stakeholders to really follow through on that regulatory change and deliver nature-based solutions at scale. And now Peru has used that system to invest in over 200 nature-based solutions projects. You'll see here foreign assistance and multilateral institutions also play quite a big role in this region. Then finally, last but definitely not least, Africa led global growth in nature-based solutions for water. We saw 5 times growth in Africa, including increasing number of large-scale public initiatives. The South Africa Working for Water program I mentioned earlier has been in place since the late 1990s. That program has now, it was originally designed to clear invasive species that were putting pressure on water security in the country. That program's now cleared over 1 million hectares previously covered by invasive species, and provided jobs to 20,000 people, including women. At the beginning of the decade, we tracked just one program in Africa investing over $1 million annually in 2023. That was that South African program. But by the end of the decade, we've tracked 16 programs of that size. So we've really seen growth across the region. Foreign assistance and multilateral institutions participated in 10 of those programs through loans to governments and played a bigger role here than we saw in any other region. Private sector involvement, particularly through foundations, also played a larger role here than in any other region. Again, that was a very quick overview of a ton of data and trends. Please consider it an introduction to the report. The download link is live now, so you'll be able to take a closer look yourself. And right now, I'll hand it over to Brooke Atwell from the Nature Conservancy, who will walk us through some of the key recommendations that accompany the data in the report.
Thanks so much, Mia. And just before we go over to Brooke, I wanted to take the opportunity to ask a few questions that are coming in through the audience to you, Mia. So one question that folks are really interested to hear the answer to is whether we found examples of private sector actors investing in their own value chains, potentially as part of larger landscape initiatives.
Yes, definitely. And so I should have mentioned that in the user-driven investment slide where we were looking at direct beneficiaries investing in their source watershed. There I mentioned utilities, cities, and companies. We kind of focused on utilities, but there definitely was voluntary private investment there. We saw increasing investments for sectors like beverage and technology companies, beverage companies that might be interested in ensuring the water supplies for their bottling plants, or technology companies that are increasingly using cooling water for their data centers are starting to have commitments to investing in these types of solutions. So definitely, yes.
Great, thanks. And I see this other one, which are a couple of questions related to the different type of language that we found. So some of the programs or projects that we track call it nature-based solutions. Some are payments for ecosystem services. Could you talk a little bit about the terminology and the different kind of names for these types of interventions and programs that we see in the diversity of what we're tracking?
Sure. Yeah, that change in language is definitely something that's taking place in this space, and I think a lot of spaces. The last Forest Trends report on the subject in 2016 was actually called The State of Watershed Investment, tracking similar types of investments. So again, whether you call them watershed investments, in some cases, green infrastructure, or green investments, nature-based solutions. What we really focused on here were what interventions are being invested in. And when we worked with our research assistants, we developed a list of keywords that helped us identify what types of designs that we wanted to include. And so we encompassed a whole range of those different languages and terms.
Great. And then one more, I'm going to put you on the spot before we go over to Brooke. There's one question, which is ballpark. If we exclude China's part of this report and we look at the rest of the world, what does the overall amount of investment look like? And are there any different big changes in kind of the major trends that we see?
Sure. So the overall investment was about $50 billion. I think China came in at 26, so about half. So a little more than half. So the ballpark would be about $25 billion in the rest of the world. And we saw, again, a lot more growth in these other regions than we did in China. And one thing that was really interesting that we saw in the analysis is that when we look at the other types of mechanisms outside of the public incentives for landholders, we saw about 3 times growth of that globally. But when we took out China, we saw 10 times growth in that specific space. So we're seeing a lot more diversity in some of the regions outside of China.
Super. Okay, thank you so much, Mia. Great job on the presentation and on the report. So next, I'm very happy to introduce Brooke Atwell, Associate Director of Resilient Watersheds at the Nature Conservancy. Brooke is also a co-author of the report and has been a core member of the team since the very inception of this collaboration. Brooke will present key recommendations developed by several authors of the report and members of the report's advisory group, composed of experts and practitioners working to advance nature-based solutions for water security around the world. So over to you, Brooke.
Thanks so much, Jenna. All right, so as she mentions, this report has a series of recommendations that kind of talk about how we might diversify and accelerate some of those investments in nature-based solutions for water security. And while I am representing today, I do want to acknowledge that these recommendations were developed and endorsed by a group of experts and practitioners that you see on your screen right now. All of us are acting in our individual capacities. So this report really confirms that nature-based solutions are no longer fringe, or I guess the panel can debate that. We can probably have a deeper discussion about whether we think these investment numbers mean fringe or not fringe. But UNEP's 2023 report found that NbS driven by water goals now actually represent one of the most resilient sources of financing for nature. That said, the field still remains largely fragmented and continues to face some pretty persistent challenges. So nature-based solutions are still not fully integrated into gray infrastructure planning, which really results in a lot of missed opportunities to kind of increase that resilience and the cost effectiveness of these assets, as well as capitalize on many of the co-benefits. Long-term funding for operational expenditures is still lacking. This is really a challenge that affects all infrastructure, but is especially acute for nature-based solutions, given some of the limited precedent and dedicated funding streams for NbS. In places where demand for NbS has grown, the delivery markets to match that demand signal is still very weak. These shortages surface in both the equipment side of things and also the workforce. For example, a lack of project developers, procurement officers, local labor, that can all slow delivery of NbS projects. Additionally, funding from national governments continues to dominate, as we saw in Mia's presentation, but continued growth or even maintenance of that funding in NbS investments is relatively uncertain as we move into the next decade. Furthermore, private investment is still constrained by a lack of regulation and a perception that NbS presents higher risk. Businesses have also shown a preference for unilateral investments in NbS, which has led to fragmented, siloed projects rather than really effective collective action. Project preparation costs for NbS projects can also still be difficult to cover. This is despite these project preparation studies being essential to making NbS investable. These costs can include business cases, project design, capacity development, and are really often excluded from direct investment figures. If nature were fully integrated into infrastructure planning, these costs would be systematically priced into the system, but we're not seeing that today. Current delivery models of NbS often really fall short on enabling Indigenous and local communities to participate, not only participate in, but also lead NbS design and implementation. And this limits the integration of traditional knowledge and also raises concerns about community buy-in and ownership and the long-term success of some of these projects. And last, but certainly not least, data gaps still hinder impact assessment and investment visibility. The team has come up with 5 recommendations spanning sustainable funding and supportive policies to really strengthening the delivery system and including community leadership in all phases of project development and implementation. And we'll get into what each of these entail right now. So first, around building reliable and resilient revenue models. Predictable long-term funding is essential for these projects, and this is particularly acute given the rising risks to centralized public funding for nature-based solutions. While the scale of national funding will not be replaced by other payers in the short term, models that really draw on the direct beneficiaries of NbS, such as water users or property owners, have shown the greatest promise for durability and growth. And so we recommend that project developers look to mainstream some of those revenue models based on user fees. Those are often integrated into tariffs and managed by public agencies or utilities. We also recommend that they leverage co-benefits to diversify the funders investing in the NbS program. This may also provide resiliency or a buffer to some of these market changes in one sector when you have additional funding sources that you can rely on. Bridging capacity gaps in low resource settings, especially in least developed countries, where development assistance and philanthropy will remain essential to fund NbS, while local revenue generation remains limited. With aid levels declining, support should really focus on building the foundations, those legal frameworks, the capacity, the pilot projects that prove NbS work to enable future self-sustaining models into the future. Speaking of enabling conditions, our second recommendation is really all about strengthening policy and planning. So upstream policies and planning frameworks really shape the feasibility and the quality of NbS investments. And we need to embed NbS into related agendas like national infrastructure, biodiversity, and disaster risk reduction. We recommend leveraging national commitments under these kind of overarching global policy frameworks. Countries should clearly link both public and private investments in NbS to their plans for meeting national targets. That could include the SDGs, the NDCs, the NAPs, the NBSAPs, and the Freshwater Challenge can be a helpful platform for reporting progress across all of these frameworks. Government should also integrate NbS into national infrastructure and water master planning processes to make sure that nature is included in those long-term investment priorities. So lenders like MDBs can also issue policy loans to help government agencies kind of build that pipeline of green or hybrid green-gray investments, and countries should leverage that to build resiliency into their infrastructure systems. Policymakers and regulators should also explicitly recognize NbS within infrastructure planning, investment, and procurement rules. This is also a really effective way to ensure local and indigenous communities are fully integrated into the NbS project cycle. Now, at every conference, on every panel, the world is really calling for more private investment in nature-based solutions. And while it won't necessarily replace public funding, private investment can absolutely play a critical role, and public partners can really help shape the enabling environment to channel this investment towards those high impact solutions. So again, policy plays a huge role here. Where politically feasible, regulations are probably the most effective tool to expand private participation in nature-based solutions. And this can include requiring contributions to publicly run initiatives based on water use, creating frameworks that link compliance with ecosystem outcomes, requiring companies to disclose water and nature-related risks, and of course, offering tax breaks associated with NbS. Collective action and public-private delivery models may also mobilize private investment. So by using public or philanthropic funds to kind of underwrite some of those transaction costs of developing PPPs, we could potentially incentivize private investments, which are often outcomes focused and less interested in some of that startup cost associated with PPPs. So performance-based approaches like the District of Columbia's Water Fund may also be able to attract private sector capital and delivery capacity. Our fourth recommendation focuses not on generating more funding, but really on building the delivery system to be able to deploy and monitor that funding. That includes generating skilled professionals, trusted data, and compelling evidence of impact. So when speaking with implementers and investors, they all noted that there is this dearth of NbS professionals kind of across master planning, project preparation, and operations. And to grow the field, we really need to train managers, planners, engineers, procurement officers, local implementers, especially in geographies where demand is growing rapidly. Also, clear region-specific technical standards for NbS can help streamline procurement and improve quality control. We also need to strengthen the monitoring and make outcomes visible to further drive investment. NbS proponents should kind of work together to build those robust MEL systems that ensure transparency and accountability, and also harnessing technologies like remote sensing kind of rooted and alongside local knowledge, can lower costs, improve consistency, and probably scale performance monitoring to attract even outcomes-based funders that need really strong monitoring of those indicators. Likewise, leveraging that MEL to communicate tangible local benefits through robust data and community voices can really build public and political will for these types of solutions. And our fifth recommendation focuses on amplifying local knowledge and leadership. So large-scale NbS programs often struggle to effectively engage local indigenous communities despite the deep knowledge of ecosystems that these communities often have. Additionally, studies have confirmed that NbS projects are more likely to be successful in the long term if they center community and indigenous leadership from the start. So NbS initiatives should embed local and indigenous leadership in design, decision-making, and implementation rather than just as beneficiaries. This includes directly funding indigenous and local communities and removing some of those systemic barriers that impact their participation. And that could look like adapting procurement policies, or facilitating partnerships that create those accessible entry points for communities to engage, sort of lowering the barrier for them to be involved in these projects. Initiatives should also ensure that local communities kind of received equitable compensation and share in the benefits created by the effort. And this should also prioritize community needs that might expand beyond water security. It might include education, health, or cultural practices to ensure that their needs are being met, not just the needs of the program. I will stop here, and I just want to shout out that the report's recommendation section has more information on what is entailed in these recommendations, including examples of where we've already seen these land on the ground. So I encourage you to dig into those more. But for now, I will turn back to Jenna.
Thanks so much, Brooke. And I'll also take the opportunity to ask you a few questions coming in from our audience here, following up on that presentation that you gave. So one, coming from Sophie Tremolay, is to which extent do you think China's experience in this area is transferable to other geographies?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think there are some really cool programs in China, like the World Bank's investment, where they're kind of scaling large-scale farmer ag BMPs at a watershed scale to reduce sediments and nutrients flowing into the river system. I think those types of investment practices are quite transferable. Um, China's an interesting case because it also has different policies and a different political framework than many other countries around the world. And so replicating the way that they disseminate investment at a national level will be very difficult, say, in Brazil, which has a very different political system. So while there are learnings, I also encourage people to kind of take seeds of inspiration and then put it and adapt it back to their local context.
There's also a question about the importance of co-benefits. So you talked about this importance. Is it because you can monetize them and they are a useful value stream, or because they in some other way sway the argument in favor of more NbS green versus gray, or instead of gray? And that's from David Schaub Jones from Tipping Point.
Yeah. I would say it's a both and. You can monetize some co-benefits to bring in additional funders, like carbon-based funders who might not be interested in the water security outcomes, but are interested in that forest that you're restoring and protecting and the outcomes that they might provide. Some co-benefits aren't necessarily monetizable and might be better slotted in what we would call public good. And there are a number of investor cases included in the report that talk about sort of these larger national or local investments that invest in a public good, not because they're monetizable per se, but because they recognize that qualitatively there's a lot of data that these projects do provide benefits, whether that's livelihoods, access to green space, human health, et cetera, et cetera. Some of those more nebulous things that might be a little bit more difficult to capture holistically.
Super. And then I get just building on that, there's a question about whether we've identified examples of blended finance mechanisms. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how that kind of the financial architecture could align with those co-benefits that we're, or multiple benefits that we're recognizing.
Yeah, absolutely. One great example is the Nairobi Water Fund in Kenya. They are sort of like the epitome of blended financing. They have private financing, they have public financing, and they were actually able to monetize those carbon benefits that I just spoke about, but in an agroforestry system example. And they were able to kind of attract funding buyer for those carbon credits from Europe. And all of that kind of goes into this blended endowment, and then they invest in nature-based solutions year over year based on the returns from that endowment. I'll also just plug that the report has some really interesting examples of blended finance, and they include links where appropriate to those projects so you can get a deeper dive onto any of them if you're interested.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much, Brooke. It's been great working with you on this and great job presenting the recommendations. So
Likewise,
thank you
Jenna,
so
pleasure.
much. All right, so now we're going to turn to a panel conversation to reflect on the findings of the report and what they mean in practice through the eyes of leaders and practitioners working in different institutions on the front lines of water management policy and finance. This will give us a chance to really ground the data in real-world experience, understanding these trends that we see in the report and how they might look in different places, and then exploring where we go from here. So I'm so pleased to be joined by three outstanding panelists for this portion of the webinar. Klaas de Groot is the co-lead of the Global Program on Nature-Based Solutions for Climate Resilience in the Water Department at the World Bank, where he supports countries to design and finance water infrastructure systems that are resilient, inclusive, and nature positive. Max Carbajal, Director of Policy and Regulation for Construction and Sanitation at Peru's Ministry of Housing, Construction and Sanitation. Max has been instrumental in advancing public investment frameworks and policies that integrate nature-based solutions at the national level in Peru. And Leonardo Manis, Executive Director for Water and Sanitation at the City of Cape Town in South Africa, who brings a local government perspective on integrating nature-based solutions into water management in one of the world's most water-stressed urban areas. We're looking forward to an open conversation about what it takes to translate ambition into action and how we can work together to scale and sustain investment in nature-based solutions for water security. Before we get started, I do want to note that part of the panel will be in Spanish. So here's a reminder that if you are an English speaker and require translation, you can select that option in the globe icon at the bottom of your screen at this moment. So let's dive in, starting with reflections on the past decade, exploring what drove growth and why. Klaas. Multilateral development banks played a major role in scaling nature-based solutions investment over the past decade. We found that multilateral support through non-repayable instruments like grants grew 10 times globally, and combined with loans, multilaterals backed over half of NbS investments in Latin America and the Caribbean, and nearly 70% in Africa. So my question for you is, how has the World Bank's approach to integrating nature-based solutions into water sector investments evolved over the past decade? And what drove that shift? What made it possible?
Thank you, Jenna. And first of all, thank you very much for having me, and huge congratulations for the launching of this super interesting document. I started about 10 years ago with the World Bank, and I remember that during that time I took every opportunity there was to mention the opportunities of nature-based solutions to be included in projects. But now, since then, there's been a huge development in adopting the concept of nature-based solutions in the World Bank. It is clearly part of our thinking, and colleagues are looking for better balances between green and gray. And it is even part of some of the country partnerships from frameworks and the country climate development reports. So these are huge steps. And we see that countries are also adopting the concept and including them in their highest strategic documents. We don't see NbS as a panacea, but it can solve challenges related to water security. It can address part of it, and it can make grey investments more efficient. And the numbers in the that are presented in the report are in line with what we see in the World Bank. Especially over the last 3 years, we see a huge increase. In 2023, there was a $3 billion portfolio in the World Bank that included nature-based solutions. But it was also related to the framing of the projects. Now, we've always been doing watershed management programs, but part of it is that we're able now to frame it better as nature-based solutions. And we see this in different sectors, including in environment, urban development, water supply and sanitation, but also in hydropower and agriculture. And it has been a result of hard work of our colleagues in different sectors. And currently, we've got 2 multi-million-dollar programs financed by GFDRR and GEF. So those organizations also make it possible that the World Bank works on integrating nature-based solutions in their programs. And also we're receiving funding from the Global Water Security and Sanitation Partnership to make this all possible. We're using that to promote the development of projects, to do internal trainings, also with the Nature Conservancy, and we've got what we call brown bag lunches, where we exchange experiences of projects and best practices. And the global program on nature-based solutions for resilience specifically focuses on collaboration with other institutions and developing knowledge products. I invite you to have a look at the website naturebasedsolutions.org, where you can find a lot of information on what the World Bank does and what type of knowledge products there have been developed. And the program also provides operational support to task teams to help them improve the dialogue with clients, which is super important, and to improve the preparation and implementation of projects. And one of those instruments is the nature-based opportunity scan, which has been developed over the last 2 years. And with the nature-based opportunity scan, we've been able to assist over 100 cities in more than 40 countries, different countries, and informed $1.8 billion in World Bank's portfolio. And an additional development that we see now for the World Bank, the creation of jobs is a very important criterion, because without creation of jobs, there's no development. And we're working together with the International Labour Organization to see how we can also quantify, aside from all the different co-benefits that have already been mentioned in the presentations, also how to quantify jobs as one of the important effects of including nature-based solutions or integrating nature-based solutions in our projects.
Thank you so much, Klaas. And so it was great to hear that, kind of starting with internal champions such as yourself at the World Bank, but then also kind of working with the clients to be able to identify opportunities for nature-based solutions to help them to achieve their goals. Really, it's great to hear about that investment that the bank is doing, and that's kind of upstream strategy and project development that's allowing for these new types of solutions to really enter the field, and great resources that you just were able to share with all of us. So thank you for that. And now I'd like to turn to Max Carvajal. So Max, Peru has emerged as a regional leader in nature-based solutions investment, with a 7-fold increase from 2016 to 2023. Driven largely by domestic public investment. The idea of natural infrastructure has gained real traction and is increasingly built into infrastructure planning. So my question for you is, how has this transformation played out in Peru's drinking water sector, and what shifts have you seen, and what factors enabled them? Ahora en español. Max, Perú se ha consolidado como líder regional en inversión en soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, con un crecimiento de 7 veces entre 2016 y 2023, impulsado principalmente por fuentes nacionales públicas. El concepto de la infraestructura natural ha ganado terreno y se está integrando en la planificación de infraestructura. Entonces, la pregunta para ti es, ¿cómo se ha reflejado esta transformación en el sector de agua potable en Perú? ¿Y qué cambios importantes has observado y qué factores los hicieron posibles?
Muchas gracias, Jenna,
So, hello everyone.
por la
Hi,
invitación.
Jenna.
Una
Thank you for
felicitación
the
enorme por el
invitation.
trabajo
Congratulations for this
realizado.
great work you have been doing
Muy
until
buen
now.
trabajo.
I think this is
Pude
a
leerlo y
wonderful
estoy seguro
work.
que quienes
I
puedan
got to read
leerlo
the
van
report
a
and I
tener
invite everyone to
también,
read the report because
creo
you
que hay
will
una
have the
muy grata
idea
sorpresa
and you will
por
see
los
a
hallazgos
huge
tan
surprise
interesantes
of
que
all
hemos
this
presentado el día de hoy.
information that we
Voy a
are
la respuesta.
presenting today.
En
I
el
will go to
Perú,
the
la
answer. In
conservación
Peru,
de las
the
fuentes de
conservation
agua
of the water,
comienza
it starts
hace
on
no pocos años,
not
comienza
few years, it start
aproximadamente en el
around in
2007 en Moyobamba, y
27
no
in
comienza por una
Mojobanda,
ley, no
and it
comienza
doesn't
por
start by
una
a law or a
obligación
governmental
normativa, sino que comienza
normative. It
porque la
starts
población
basically
se pone de
because the
acuerdo
community, the
para
local community
aportar
come together to
un sol
support
adicional, que es
an
como un
additional
tercio de dólar,
sol, which
más o
is
menos,
third or quarter of dollar, more or less.
35 centavos de
It will be
dólar
like $35
mensualmente en su
monthly
tarifa de
in
agua
their
potable
water
y saneamiento
tariff,
para conservar sus
and
fuentes de
to
agua potable.
ensure this security
Esto
of
continúa
the
en el
water
tiempo.
resources,
En el
and they continue with this
2012 se
process. Now in
presenta una situación
2012, they start with
complicada
a
entre
complicated
la
situation
empresa de
between
Cusco,
the
Seda Cusco,
Cusco
y los
community and the
pobladores de la
Cusco
principal
local
fuente de agua
entity,
superficial
water
en aquel
entity, and the
momento, la
superficial
laguna de
water at that
Piuray.
moment, which is the
Esta
Piuray Lagoon.
situación
This
lleva
situation
a que
escalate
Cusco
into a
incluya
national
en
situation,
sus
and Cusco
inversiones
include
un
within
monto
their
importante de
national
dinero, casi
financial,
10% de
I
sus
will say
ingresos
like a
destinados
10% of
a la
their income. They
conservación
focus it
de la
on
laguna de
the
Piray. Diversas medidas,
natural
algunas de ellas
conservation and different
verdes y algunas de
measurements,
ellas
some of them
marrones.
green and
También
some of
tenía
them
escasos
brown,
agua,
because they also
teniendo
have like
población
different
alrededor de la laguna
difficulties with
y
the
su acceso
communities
a agua
around that
potable
lagoon because they
o
didn't have
saneamiento.
access
Esto
to the
continúa en el
water,
tiempo
and
y
this continue
aparece
along the time. And
probablemente el
then
mayor hito
I
en
can
el
see
caso
this
peruano,
this
que es
is
la
the
ley
huge and
Merece, la
important
ley de
regarding the regulation,
mecanismos
which is the
de
ley
retribución
merece,
por
which is
servicios
the
ecosistémicos.
retribution by
La ley Merece
ecosystemic
plantea
information.
una
This
solución
plan a
provinciana,
special
una
solution
solución
related
donde
all
los
the
actores
water
contribuyentes y
basin, in which all the
retribuyentes,
people
en
who
este
are
caso
paying
las
their
empresas de
service,
agua
especially
por un
the
lado
water
y
companies by
los
one side, and
comuneros o
also
las comunidades
the
por otro
communities
lado,
or local
se
communities
ponen de
from the other
acuerdo.
side, they come
Sin
together.
embargo,
But there is
esto
one main
avanza
problem because
bastante
these
bien, ya que
advance
se
in a
incluye
progressive way
en la
because they also
tarifa de las
include in
empresas de agua potable en el país
clear
un
water
monto
tariff a
para
specific amount, and this
destinado
specific amount will go
exclusivamente para la
directly,
conservación de agua. Es
exclusively
decir,
to water
se incluye
conservancy.
un
And
pequeño
this is
fondo, una
a
reserva
percentage.
que
They
varía
call it like a
entre el
reserve that vary
1% y
maybe
el
from around
10%,
1%
dependiendo de la
and
empresa en el
10%,
país,
depending on the
para
company in
conservación
the
de las fuentes
country,
de agua.
to
Esto me hace
preserve
acordar no
the
tanto a una
water. And
solución
this makes me
pijuviana,
remember
no tanto a una
not to
solución
a
coagiana, sino más
special
bien
a
a una solución
coaxial solution,
pijoviana, una
but a
solución donde esto
Pigovian
parece más un
solution,
tax
maybe
que
something like a
un
tax,
acuerdo.
in
Sin
which
embargo,
we can focus it
ninguna de
either
estas
as a tax or an
implementaciones en las
agreement. But
empresas
none
de
of
agua en
these
el
two
Perú
implementation
hubiese
in
sido
the Peru
posible
water
si
company
no
could
hubiesen
be
habido
possible if
grupos
there wasn't
impulsores
be a
alrededor,
local community
grupos que le han
that
dado
improve and that give the
validez a
importance
los
and
acuerdos
validity to the
y
different
han hecho que
agreements
estos
that they did
acuerdos
with the
sean
government. And
creíbles.
they also
Estos
make that
grupos
these
han incluido
agreements
a sociedad
become
civil,
true.
han
There are
incluido
social
a la
communities,
academia, han
there are
incluido a
academics, there are
municipios u
institutions,
otras
small
organizaciones
municipalities and
del
small governments
gobierno,
from the
entre otros
internal
ONGs,
government
muchas de
in
ellas,
ONGs
entre otros
also,
actores.
different
Entonces,
type
esto
of
me hace
people
acordar
involved
más
in this.
a
And
una
this makes me
solución
remember
como la
more than
planteada por
a
Elinor
solution,
Ostrom
maybe as how
en su
Elinor
famoso libro de
Ostrom proposed it in his
1990
important book
de El
from
gobierno de los
1990
bienes
that
comunes.
knows
Me
that the
parece más bien
government
la
from the
solución que
Commonwealth.
hay en el
And I
Perú
think that this
en
is the
agua
solution
potable y
that we have in
saneamiento para
Peru
la
related
conservación de
with
las fuentes de agua.
sanitation
Una
and clear
solución
water. This is a special solution
cooperativa como
because
la
it's very
planteada por Ostrom.
cooperative. It's like a
Actualmente, cerrando
cooperation
esta
they
parte de
have.
la
And right now on today, they have approximately 40% of the water company in Peru is investing or doing actions and financing around these clear water solutions. And all of the companies, 100% of them have special funds with these requirements or with this objective.
Muchas gracias, Maxi. Qué interesante resaltar esta experiencia que realmente inició desde abajo con las poblaciones poniéndose de acuerdo o buscando soluciones a estas dificultades entre las comunidades y las empresas de agua en algunos casos y cómo estas soluciones se ha institucionalizado y se ha replicado en el país a través de la política nacional y así también se está fortaleciendo el cambio. Thank you, Max. We'll come back to you in a second. So now I'd like to turn to Leonardo Manis from the city of Cape Town. So Leonardo, Cape Town's Day Zero crisis brought global attention to water security, as I'm sure that you are aware. In response, the city turned to nature-based solutions as part of its broader strategy, backed by partnerships like the partnerships through the Cape Town Water Fund. So what we would love to know is, how did Cape Town come to embrace nature-based solutions in the response to its water crisis? And what were the key enabling conditions, especially around building collective action and securing co-investment by different actors?
Thank you very much, Jenna. It's an opportunity that came along with a challenge. And I think that there was nothing and no one in Cape Town who was not affected by Day Zero. So there's basically two forces that actually cause a partnership between three parties. Basically, the first party was the private sector that came to the party, and then the public sector, which was the city of Cape Town, which is a local municipality, the metropolitan. And the third party was actually the local community itself as well, in areas where these projects were implemented. So the driving force, Cape Town, we don't debate whether climate change is a real thing or not, because we've experienced it and we're still experiencing it. And that effect that was felt, because just keeping in mind that there's nothing as restrictive to development as water scarcity. If there's no water, it's very difficult to actually do development. And the private sector was tremendously affected by that as well. It also formed a catalyst in terms of how to look at water differently. Not only in a little isolations, whether there's a dam or whether there's a borehole, what the case may be, but brought systemic change rather, and also a systems thinking approach to how we approach water. And this even brought Cape Town to think of wastewater differently, where wastewater is no longer wastewater, but is now a source. And as Klaas has said earlier, we're not looking at nature-based solutions as the answer to all prayers in this regard, but we do very much see its role, how it will play in terms of the overall water supply to Cape Town. So the efforts that has been undertaken in this public-private collaboration that was formed with a private sector in Cape Town in the creation of the Greater Cape Town Water Fund was basically that systemic change that came as a catalyst to look at the whole system differently. And that driving force also then was shared by everyone. And there's a second force, and that was the cohesion force. And that was basically that there was a common goal to ensure that we don't experience the restrictions and restrictive conditions that came along with the drought situation. And this was to ensure that we can actually identify the areas where these investments can be made, and which should be those areas where the return of investment will be highest. And that meant that both public and private actually agreed on the areas where to be moving in. And the common goal was to actually have this fragmentized to a point where we could actually see the gains. And the gains to date, we've actually got to a point where we have 48 megaliters per annum that is being contributed to our water supply, which is about 15% of our annual supply comes now from restored water supply through these nature-based solutions. And so those are two elements that I can add to the point was those two cohesive forces. The driving force was the drought, and the cohesive force was the common goal shared by all parties around the table to ensure that we make a positive impact through with nature-based solutions as well.
That's so great, Leonardo. It's great to hear 15% of the water supply now coming from restored watershed areas through nature-based solutions. That's just so remarkable. And I love kind of connecting with what Klaus said about nature-based solutions not being a panacea, but really being part of this shift to systems thinking. I think that also connects to what Max was saying about nature-based solutions in Cusco first emerging as a kind of response to help to build a bridge between the water utility and the upstream communities, first through kind of addressing the social issue and then kind of getting into what the watershed management looks like. Likewise, when we're looking at addressing such a major challenge like the water scarcity that Cape Town faces, really taking the systems approach that sometimes starting with nature-based solutions allows us to kind of adopt this systems thinking approach that also opens up other solutions because we begin to see the watershed and actors in a different way. And sometimes it's an incidental benefit of first taking that systems approach. So I love to hear kind of how that complements each other. So what I would love to do with the panel now is to think in the future. So we were looking back 10 years now. Let's look ahead 10 years. And coming back to you, Klaus, we're thinking together 10 years from now, what's the best case scenario for nature-based solutions investment? We know that we're in a very kind of volatile and uncertain time for lots of reasons, but let's imagine really like, what could be the best case scenario? And if we get there, what would we have done starting now that would have made the biggest difference, right? Okay, so Klaus, I'd like to ask you, what could the World Bank's role look like in scaling nature-based solutions further with its partners in the countries that it works with? What are the key shifts both within the banks, and then what would you see among the governments that you work with or in other actors that would unlock significantly greater investment and ultimately more impact and benefit from nature-based solutions for water security?
Thank you, Gina, and I love the discussion and replies of Max and Leonardo. As indicated, there's an increased interest in our client countries. Now they want to look at nature-based solutions and what opportunities nature-based solutions can offer to make projects or investments more efficient. So that's for us the principal driver for it has been the principal driver, and it will remain the principal driver for the next 10 years as well. And they're becoming more convinced of the efficiency gain that can be achieved. We all know the numbers about the needs of investments in the water sector, be it on water management, on water services, or on resilience. And we all know that with public financing, that cannot be achieved. So we have to look at involvement of the private sector. We've been doing that over the last few years, but first of all, an important task is to continue our dialogue with the clients and improve our understanding of nature-based solutions, improve the enabling environments and also the governance structures and regulations. For example, in relation to water rights, and further improve our ability to do comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. It has already been mentioned, but how can you monetize the different co-benefits, and how do you make sure that those who benefit will also provide the financing for the different interventions? The work that is being done by IASD with JEF funding is very important for us because they have a lot of cost-benefit analysis already. And what we see is that there are a lot of ex ante analysis, but especially the ex post analysis after 10 years. What happened with the nature-based solutions, and how did it benefit different actors in those groups? In those countries is super important. So if we go back to the investments or the participation of the private sector, we see examples to implement nature-based solutions through corporate responsibility and tax incentives. Investors are willing to invest in green bonds. But to really scale up, we have to look at the business models of investors in the watersheds, and to ensure that land use and positive and that the land use has a positive effect on water security. A good example of that is the Catskills Wetlands Management Program for the water supply of New York, which has proven to be very positive in relation to the OPEX and CAPEX of the water company. And we also have to look at the business models of companies that are not directly related to water security, but do have a strong impact on the water systems in the upstream areas. And as you probably all know, the IFC is part of the World Bank Group, and they have the possibility to work with the private sector. Together with them, we can evaluate how this collaboration can be done in a sustainable manner, which is super important, with the objective to improve availability and quality of water and to reduce flood risks. And at the same time, also achieve the objectives related to the business model, whether it is wood production, for example, or agriculture in the upstream areas. And also MIGA can play an important role, which is the part of the World Bank that can provide guarantees for investors that are willing to invest in our client countries. So the combined support from the World Bank can bring in other investors and identify opportunities with green bonds, carbon credits, debt swaps, and also incentives related to the interests that countries pay for our loans to scale up these types of interventions and achieve the impacts that are necessary in many of those countries. And those impacts are necessary to achieve or to address their challenges to water security and to be prepared to the effects that climate change unfortunately will bring.
Great, thank you so much, Klaas. And you've also answered one of the questions in the chat from the audience about really what are the options for bringing in the private sector in this space that's so heavily dominated by public sector funding and finance. These opportunities to bring in both private capital through instruments like green bonds, but then also engaging private companies on the landscapes where they're working and in their own interests, so finding ways to be able to build that financial architecture like we were speaking about earlier, and building on the great work with the clients. And speaking of World Bank clients, I'll go to Max in Peru now. And what I would like to ask Max is, from the perspective of Peru's drinking water sector, what would it look like if really natural infrastructure were to become fully institutionalized, and what critical gaps in policy, finance, or capacity would need to be addressed to make that vision possible? Entonces, otra vez en español, Max, ¿cómo se vería el sector de agua potable en Perú si el concepto y la práctica de la infraestructura natural sea institucionalizado completamente? ¿Cuáles son los vacíos más urgentes o importantes en política, financiamiento o en capacidades que se debe abordar desde ahora para lograr esta visión?
Excelente. Esta es una
Excellent.
pregunta muy
So
importante.
this is
Nosotros hemos
a very
tratado de
important question. We try to
avanzando
continue
respecto a los
advancing
desafíos de
related to
política. Por
different
ejemplo,
challenges that we
tuvimos
have with
una
the policy. For
modificación
example, we had
en
a
la ley de agua
modification
potable y
in
saneamiento en el
the
país. Ese es el decreto
one of the law in the
legislativo
country.
1280.
It's
Se
the
modificó y se incluyeron
1280 law, and we
diversos
also
aspectos,
include
puedo
different
decirlo de
aspects,
esta manera,
and I'm going
con
to
una
mention it
mirada
in this way
bastante
with
verde,
a
con
green
una mirada de
perspective, with
conservación de las fuentes de agua,
conservation
pero
of the
sobre todo con
water
una mirada
upstream,
de
but also
sostenibilidad
with
hídrica desde el sector agua potable
security
y
from
saneamiento.
the
A eso nosotros le
principal
hemos
water funds, and
denominado
this is
como
something that we
viabilidad.
call
Las
trust in this
modificaciones
part.
van
The different
desde
modifications
aspectos
goes
como, por ejemplo,
from aspects such
incluir
as become and go to the front and include that water source in the entire water chain. And this is something important because in this case, we have to modernize water management framework. For example, utilities like CEDAPAL and regional company, and we have to focus on the conservation and future treatment of that water. So having that trust is another step. Right now, we are working on a path related with the trust of the providing the different water services. And we divide it in two parts. We divide it from the upstream and from the different distribution of the water, focusing on the conservation, protection, and restoration. We have such amount of tasks that involve financing on the companies, but it also involve public investment. It also involves other mechanisms such as the possibility to have different type of partnership related with private and public companies so that they can focus on the people. Related to capacities, we have a huge gap, but we also develop different ways, interested ways, like for example, the owned company don't have to be in charge of financing the conservation or the water security, but they can also focus that investment maybe on a specific agents that have specialty with this. For example, agency that is focused on water conservation, or a place in Arequipa in Peru, which named CEDAPAR. So we have certain measurement in that way. And there is one present problem, which is having the financial part. The funds that the companies are gathering right now are monthly funds that they save month by month, and they reserve these funds in their treasury or in their funds for conservation, even though the infrastructure or the natural infrastructure have a huge gap. And right now we have a low and inconsistent funding for natural infrastructure, heavy reliance on project-based external donor firms, and we have a short-term funding, which is monthly. And what we want to do is to ensure that those funds that we have future flows, we can apply them and we can improve them so that we can have more important investment today and we can go doing the payment during the years. And it is something important that I also want to mention, and it's true that right now we are opening different mechanisms so that we can invest in the conservation of water funds and in the water security from the internal part. Two simple examples, apart from having partnership with public and private companies, we also have EPS. And in Peru, we have a mechanism that is works by tax, and the next one is services by tax. And in summary, is the possibility for a private company to focus part of what they were going to pay on tax directly on generating infrastructure, gray, and in this case, natural infrastructure, in a way that the money don't go through the entire public cycle to then take this investment, but it go directly to the natural infrastructure. So another mechanism that we are applying right now in Peru case, and that we also include for the conservation from different water and secure of the water, in this case, it's the executions of the knuckles. In basically summary, this is a mechanism that allows us that the community can do the investment with a small public organization in a faster way than comparing with a public company. In this way, we can have more mechanisms to apply and to execute those investments into natural infrastructure.
Muchas gracias, Max. Voy a cambiar a inglés para resaltar un par de puntos que me pareció muy interesantes. So many thanks, Max. And I think a few points I wanted to highlight from what you just said. One, the work that the Ministry of Housing and in general, the water sector, water and sanitation sector in Peru is doing to really bring in the systems thinking approach to kind of the value chain that brings us the water for water supply is so important. And this work that you're doing on a roadmap of kind of the reliability of the source, I think of as another way to think about the kind of resilience planning for the water source. And I think it's really forward looking. And then on top of that, really thinking about not just that big picture of the system that we're working in and how we're managing, but even then how you're operationalizing the delivery to be able to bring in the private sector through mechanisms like public-private partnerships, or obras por impuestos, the taxes, kind of public works for taxes with the private sector, but also with these kind of execution mechanisms with local communities so that they can directly take on the leadership of implementing some of these projects, which allows for much more local ownership. And that responds to one of the questions that we had in the chat and one of the key recommendations from following the report. So thanks so much for those insights. And then finally, back to Leonardo, from the perspective of a city like Cape Town, how can we go from pilot projects to systemic investment in watershed scale NbS? You all have done it. You've already got 15% of your water supply coming from nature-based solutions that you've been able to show so far. What would you say to other cities that they need in terms of governance, financing, or technical capacity to really kind of make that leap or bridge from pilots to systemic action?
Thank you for that question. I think the first thing that we need to actually discern between what is possible and what is affordable, because there are many things that's possible in the space of water supply management, but not everything is affordable, because the city has to sustain itself financially to actually be in that space where it can sustain any program that it starts investing in. Because the moment you don't have a viable public entity, it is very difficult to create trust in the private sector to partner you. So there's need to be that level of trust to establish right from the onset, to actually remain in a space where you can say, I am a financial viable public entity that you can partner with. Now, we've done quite well as a city of Cape Town in that space, and our audit reports and everything shows, and even our credit rating with Moody's actually shows that. And that is where we are quite religious, for the lack of another word, in actually sustaining that, to ensure that we sustain that financial health as far as this matter is concerned. Moving back to the NbS, the nature-based solutions part, I think that what we also need to go on further is also to operationalize that as part of our financial management matter in the city itself. For now, it works as a portion of a contribution that the city is making as its commitment to the partnership with the private sector through the special purpose vehicle that we have in terms of the nature conservancy. But the fact is, what we might need to do is actually to work out and to use that unit cost to bring it into our operational budget. Noting the fact that you have to perhaps start a conversation regarding whether the initial clearance shouldn't be capitalized, shouldn't be seen as a capital investment, and whether the maintenance clearance is seen as operational investment, and actually bring the distinction between the two to actually make it much easier financially, or more palatable financially, to actually invest in nature-based conservation, nature-based solutions. The more difficult hurdle to jump over, Jenna, might be to fight and lobby bureaucracy as far as our federal or national government might be concerned, who are quite lean. And I think that both Klaus and Max might have mentioned it earlier as well, that there is a bias towards grey infrastructure, and the whole financial mechanism set up, even though there's great grant systems in South Africa that has been set up to assist local government, it is leaning towards grey infrastructure. And we need to understand and make a case for it, that if we are willing to invest significant amounts of capital in grey infrastructure such as desalination and other options that can contribute 15 to 20% of our demand, and we have shown through, we can scientifically prove that we have already restored 15% of our water supply through our ecological infrastructure investment. there is a case to be made to actually review the bureaucracy as far as funding assistance from national government is also concerned. But lastly, also, I think that it's not only out of this arrangement that we have in Cape Town, but has been in other experiences that we've seen before, that you also need a very credible special purpose vehicle or institution to ensure that both parties have trust and faith in it, and to ensure that it delivers according to the agreement. Because the moment parties don't see deliverables according to the agreement, it's also going to hamper the sustainability of what you are investing in. And these are aspects that's currently on the table in the city of Cape Town, being discussed to ensure that we sustain, because we have seen what the investment has brought as far as the capital, the initial clearances are concerned. The higher return of investment is actually in the latter part, which is the maintenance part, to ensure that we sustain what we have invested in. And that's the reason why we need to continue what we started with.
That's great. Thank you so much, Leonardo. And I really kind of hear in that just the journey that you've taken going from nature-based solutions as kind of part of this vision of what the future could be like, to then really practically how to work it into the institutions, into the investment, into kind of the special purpose vehicle that is able to really deliver the solutions in a way that practically shows the benefits and that is able to sustain the scale and continuation. And I hear that in different ways from all of our panelists. And I think that's largely kind of the journey that we're on with nature-based solutions for water globally, where we have this strong track record. We've gone beyond the pilot scale, the local kind of trying it out scale, and we're now really starting to mainstream. And we have these cases in specific cities or institutions or countries where we've really started to integrate nature-based solutions. There are great lessons and tools and strategies from those places that we can learn from in other places that are starting that journey, and we can begin to learn how do we address these issues of, for example, the investment system being very biased towards gray infrastructure. How can we build the capacities quicker? How can we make better decisions so we're really investing in water security and resilience in the smartest, most kind of systems thinking way that's actually really going to deliver for our populations. So I just really want to thank the panelists for such a rich discussion. I want to thank the co-authors and partners for this report, our wonderful advisory group for supporting the development of the report and the recommendations. And I want to thank all of you who have joined us today. For the webinar, you'll be able to find the report online. It's live, so we invite you to check it out, share it, and just thank you again so much for your interest. If you have any questions, please get in touch with us. Have a great day. Take care, everybody.